The cold wind swept through the busy city streets as people hurried past, their faces buried in scarves and their hands stuffed into pockets. Among them, a little girl no older than 10 stood at the entrance of a massive glass building, her tiny hands clutching a small basket filled with colorful candies. Her clothes were worn, her shoes barely holding together, but her eyes held a quiet determination. Every morning, before the city truly woke up, she stood there, offering her candies to the passing workers, flashing them a shy but hopeful smile. Some would buy, dropping a few coins into her palm. Others ignored her completely, too preoccupied with their own lives. Inside that towering building, a man watched from the warmth of his office. His name was Richard Langston, a self-made millionaire who had built his company from the ground up. He had worked hard, sacrificed everything, and now stood at the top of the corporate world. But success had hardened him. To Richard, the world was simple. Those who worked hard succeeded, and those who didn't were left behind. He had no patience for street vendors or beggars. He saw them as obstacles, nuisances disrupting the flow of his well-oiled business empire. One morning, as he arrived in his sleek black car, he noticed the little girl again. She was standing near the entrance, her soft voice offering candies to the workers rushing inside. Richard frowned. He didn't like this. This was his company, his property. He didn't build a multi-million-dollar empire just to have a child loitering outside like some charity case. His jaw tightened as he turned to his assistant. "I want her gone," he said coldly. "She's bad for business." His assistant hesitated. "She's just a kid, sir. She's not causing any harm." Richard shot him a sharp look. "I said get rid of her." A few minutes later, security approached the girl. She looked up at them with wide, confused eyes as they spoke to her. Their voices weren't harsh, but firm. She wasn't allowed to sell there. She had to leave. Her small hands gripped the basket. "Tighter. Please. I just need to sell a few more," she whispered. But rules were rules. The guards gently but insistently moved her away from the entrance, past the heavy glass doors, onto the cold sidewalk. She stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do. The city moved around her, indifferent. Her tiny fingers trembled as she clutched the candies against her chest. From his office, Richard glanced out of the window. He watched as the girl stood alone in the morning light. Her head bowed slightly. For a split second, something flickered inside him. Something unfamiliar, but he pushed it aside. He had a company to run, and in his world, there was no space for distractions. Little did he know, this was not the end of the story. This moment, this single decision, would come back to him in ways he never could have imagined. And before long, Richard Langston, the man who thought he had everything, would come to realize just how wrong he was. Days passed, but the image of the little girl standing outside his company lingered in Richard Langston's mind. He didn't understand why. It was just a minor incident, nothing worth thinking about. Yet, every time he sipped his morning coffee or signed off on a deal, he found his thoughts drifting back to her. The way her fingers trembled around her basket, the quiet desperation in her voice. It annoyed him. He had built his life on logic and efficiency. Emotions had no place in his world. But the city had its own way of keeping stories connected. One evening, as Richard stepped out of his building, he noticed a small commotion near the sidewalk. A group of employees had gathered, whispering among themselves. Curious, he walked toward them. As he did, he caught sight of something that made him pause. The same little girl, the one he had ordered to be removed, was now sitting on the ground a few feet away. Her basket of candies was tipped over, its contents scattered across the pavement. A teenage boy, no older than 16, stood over her, looking guilty. I didn't mean to, he stammered. I just bumped into her. The girl was silent, staring at the candies, as if unsure whether to pick them up or let them go. She didn't cry, didn't say a word. Richard exhaled sharply. He had no reason to care. This wasn't his problem. And yet, before he could stop himself, he spoke. Pick them up, he ordered. The boy turned, startled. Mr. Langston, I was just, I said. Pick them up. His voice was sharp, leaving no room for argument. The boy quickly bent down, gathering the candies and placing them back in the basket. Once he was done, Richard turned his gaze to the girl. You, what are you still doing here? She looked up at him, her large eyes unblinking. For the first time, Richard noticed the exhaustion on her face. She was young, but her expression held something far older, something hardened by life. I need to sell, she said simply. Her voice was steady, not pleading, not whining, just a statement. Richard frowned. Where are your parents? The girl hesitated, then looked away. My mom is sick. She can't work. I have to sell. A strange tightness gripped Richard's chest. He wasn't sure why. He had heard stories like this before. People struggling, trying to make ends meet. It was the way of the world. You worked, or you didn't survive. That was life. But something about the way she said it, something about the way she didn't beg, didn't complain, made him feel uneasy. Richard turned and walked away. He wasn't a man who got involved in things that didn't concern him. But that night, sleep didn't come easily. The next morning, as he arrived at his company, he instinctively looked toward the entrance. She wasn't there. Instead, a man in a tattered coat sat in her place, asking for spare change. Richard's chest felt oddly heavy. He brushed the feeling aside and entered the building. As days passed, his routine continued. Meetings, business deals, numbers. But no matter how much he tried, he couldn't shake the girl from his mind. He even caught himself glancing at the entrance more often than he cared to admit, expecting to see her standing there with her basket. But she never returned. One evening, after a particularly long day, he found himself taking a different route home. He wasn't sure why. Perhaps he was just tired of the same streets, the same routine. But as he turned a corner, he saw her. She was sitting on a small crate outside a convenience store, her basket half full. Her head was lowered, her shoulders slightly hunched, as people walked past her without a second glance. Something inside him twisted. Before he could think, he found himself walking toward her. He stopped in front of her, and for the first time, she looked surprised to see him. You're still selling, he said. It wasn't a question. She nodded. Have you made enough? She shook her head. Not yet. Richard sighed, running a hand through his hair. He wasn't sure what he was doing here. He had spent his whole life focused on success, on building his empire, on making sure he was never weak. But right now, looking at this little girl who barely reached his waist, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Without another word, he pulled out his wallet and handed her a bill far larger than what her entire basket was worth. Here, he said, go home. The girl stared at the money, then at him. And then, to his surprise, she shook her head. I can't take this, she said. Richard frowned. Why not? Her fingers curled around the basket. Because I'm not begging. The words hit him harder than he expected. He had spent years believing that success came only to those who worked for it. But standing in front of him was a child who, despite everything, still held on to her pride, still wanted to earn her way. For the first time in a long time, Richard didn't have an answer, and as he stood there, watching this little girl refuse his money, he realized something. Maybe, just maybe, He had been wrong about the world. Richard Langston stood there, staring at the little girl who had just refused his money. He had expected gratitude, maybe even relief. But instead, she had turned him down, not out of defiance, but out of something far rarer. Pride. He let out a slow breath, slipping the bill back into his wallet. "All right," he said, his voice quieter than usual. "How much do you sell these for?" She glanced down at the basket. $1 each. He nodded and reached for a handful of candies. "I'll take these." He pulled out the exact amount and placed it in her small palm. "Fair trade." She blinked in surprise, but slowly nodded, tucking the money into her pocket. He could tell this meant something to her, not just the sale, but the fact that she had earned it. Richard turned to leave, but something stopped him. Maybe it was the way she sat there, too small for such a big, uncaring world. Maybe it was the way she had never once asked for help. Despite clearly needing it, he glanced back at her. "What's your name?" "Emma," she said. That night, Richard couldn't stop thinking about her. He had spent his entire life building his company, focusing on profits, efficiency, and eliminating anything that didn't contribute to success. But Emma didn't fit into any of that. She was just a kid trying to survive. And yet, she had done something no one else had. She had made him question everything. The next morning, instead of going straight to his office, Richard took a detour. He found himself standing outside a small, run-down apartment building on the other side of the city. He wasn't sure what he was doing there, but after asking a few people, he finally found the door he was looking for. He knocked, and after a few moments, it opened. A tired-looking woman stood there, leaning against the frame. She had the same eyes as Emma. "Can I help you?" she asked cautiously. Richard hesitated. He had no idea what to say. He wasn't used to this. Personal matters, emotions, things that couldn't be calculated in spreadsheets. "I met your daughter," he finally said. "She sells candies near my company." The woman sighed, nodding. "Yes, she does what she can. I've been sick, and work has been impossible." Richard took a deep breath. "I have a job opening," he said. "At my company." She blinked. "Excuse me? It's not a high position," he continued. "But it's steady, decent pay, and it comes with health benefits." The woman's lips parted in shock. I don't understand. Why are you doing this?" Richard didn't have a clear answer. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was something deeper. Maybe it was the realization that success meant nothing if you forgot how to be human. He shrugged. "Your daughter works hard," he said simply. "I figured she shouldn't have to do it alone." Tears filled the woman's eyes, but she wiped them away quickly, nodding. "Thank you," she whispered. "You have no idea what this means." Richard only nodded and turned to leave, but before he did, he saw a small figure standing in the hallway. Emma. She had been listening the whole time. She looked up at him, her face unreadable, and then, for the first time, she smiled. It wasn't the kind of smile she gave strangers when selling candies. It was real, and somehow, that small, simple expression did something to Richard that no business deal ever had. As he walked away, he realized that maybe, just maybe, he had gained something far more valuable than money that day.